All right, good morning, everybody. So, as Hoshin mentioned, today we're taking up gate 101 of the 108 gates of dharma-illumination. So our gate statement for today says, entry into the state of unrestricted speech is a gate of dharma-illumination, for with it we attain realization of the dharma-eye. So first, let's look at what unrestricted speech means in this gate statement. Then we need to understand entry, because there's a few nuances there. Then we'll talk about dharma-eye, so what that is, why it's important, and finally, again, we'll intersect everything and see what comes out of that, right? So, as we do. Okay, so unrestricted speech sounds like saying whatever the heck we want at the top of our voice, right? Unrestricted speech. Is this about being completely free to express kind of whatever we want in whatever way we want? What kind of restrictions are we talking about when we talk about unrestricted speech? So the kanji here means hindrance or obstruction or disturbance or something like that. So this isn't about restricting what we say in order to follow precepts or something. Restricting what we say in order to have right speech. It's not about censoring ourselves, right, in that way, or controlling ourselves, exerting some kind of discipline, right, on ourselves. So this is pointing to being hindered by attachment to mistaken assumptions about reality. So we're attached to our ideas about what reality is and how it works, which are, as we know, by their nature, incomplete, not the whole story. So our view is being limited by our delusion, by our inability to see the entire landscape of this moment, because in this limited karmic form, we can only see some of it. We can't wrap our heads around it all. So we're sort of clinging to that delusion, that inability to see the whole thing. So, we're having a hard time carrying out right speech because of our delusion. We're having a hard time not breaking precepts because of our delusion. So whatever skill we may have in speaking or in communicating, or whatever ability we may have intellectually, is being just a little bit twisted, right? Just a little bit hindered, because we've followed our misunderstandings about the universe kind of right off the rails. So unrestricted speech comes from the point of view of unobstructed wisdom, or prajna. So it's how we speak, how we teach, how we act when we're coming from a place of clarity. So, in that place, we deeply understand impermanence and interdependence and the emptiness of five skandhas, and the way that reality actually is and actually functions. So this points us back to the way body, speech, and mind are connected when it comes to karmic action, right? First, some thought arises in the mind. On that basis, maybe we say something, maybe we're happy with what we said, maybe we regret what we said, right? And then, of course, there's the whole process of how that all happens according to the 12-fold chain of causation, or interdependent origination. So on the basis of that thought in the mind, we say something. If the thought was wholesome, chances are what we've said was wholesome, useful, beneficial, compassionate. At least there's some chance that what we say will match. If not, and that thought was not so wholesome, then we have a pretty good chance of saying something that breaks precepts or causes some kind of suffering or perpetuates some kind of delusion, right? And then we think stuff and we say stuff, and then we're likely to take some action with this body. We're probably going to do something about that related to what we think and what we say. So clearly we need to pay attention to thinking and speaking before that leads to some kind of karmic action, which could be a big mistake or not, right? So that means we can't just sort of monitor what we say or what we teach in isolation from the rest of our functioning. And this is why I'm saying this is not about I'm going to control what I say in order to, right, not break a precept or not do something unskillful. We can't just start there. We can't just sort of be gatekeepers about what comes out of our mouths and expect that then somehow everything else will be okay. This is really tied in with body, speech, and mind. So nothing arises without a cause. Suffering has roots, we know, that we can trace and we can understand. So we can't engage in unrestricted speech without also engaging in zazen, work, and study, and all the rest of our practice. In other words, practice in its entirety. We can't just pull out speech and go, well, I'm just going to do that. it's not separate from all the other parts of our practice and all the other aspects of our functioning. So again, entry into the state of unrestricted speech is a gate of dharma-illumination, for with it we attain realization of the dharma-eye. So entry into something sounds like, well, there's something we need to get or somewhere we need to go that isn't here already. We have to be careful about getting caught up in the idea that there's a fixed state we need to reach in order for something to happen. So this is translated entry into the state of unrestricted speech, but we have to be careful about state, right? It implies there's something which is fixed and not moving and not changing and just is always going to be the way it is, or there's someplace else that isn't here that we have to get to before good things happen or something happens, right? So entering into, in this context, I think is the same as Shinjin Datsuraku, dropping off body and mind. I think that's what we're entering into when we're talking about entering into some place of unrestricted speech. Realizing there's already no separation, so there's already no restriction, there's already no hindrance. This is before restriction and hindrance and obstacles get in our way. So what's keeping us from entering into is our five skandhas clinging to five skandhas. It's our most basic kinds of delusion about what this self is and what reality is and how all of this functions. If we can let go of the clinging to whatever we're clinging to, we can easily enter into, right? Some shift happens. So all this reminds me of the step in the hero's journey called crossing the threshold, and those of you who are writers will know what I mean by the hero's journey, right? It's a standard set of 17 plot points that make up the structure of most every screenplay you've ever seen, most every epic novel you've ever read, right? This is something which is sort of intrinsic to somehow to the human experience about how we tell stories, how we create myth, how we interact with those things, right? So the hero's journey. So the fifth one of these 17 plot points in the hero's journey is something called crossing the threshold. And this is the point where the protagonist has finally accepted whatever the challenge of the story is. He or she spends the first about 4 points going, no, that's not me. And then finally something shifts and the protagonist says, okay, yes, I'm going to take on this challenge. Solve this problem, whatever it is. Steps out of the ordinary world. And that could be, stepping into a new place. It could be stepping into the unknown. There's something new. So stepping out of the known world, out of the ordinary world into unknown territory of some kind in order to solve this problem. In most cases in these stories, there's some kind of threshold guardian. There is something which is a natural barrier, a dangerous entity, something which is preventing our hero from deciding to, yes, cross over, step over that threshold, enter into something. In other words, there's something scary, right, about taking that step, whatever that is. So when it comes to our practice, we may think, yes, I really want to drop off body and mind. Dogen is always telling us, Shinjin Datsuraku, drop off body and mind. Yes, I want that, that's for me. We want to really enter into that space of non-separation. Somebody's telling us that's a good thing. Or that's, we can make that into a goal. We also really want to hang on to this idea about who we are, right? We've spent all these decades building up this idea about who this is. To let go of that feels really, really scary. Stepping over that threshold, encountering that threshold guardian, which is of our own making, is really, really scary. That feels like annihilation, right? Letting go, five skandhas, letting go of clinging to five skandhas can feel like really disorienting. If I don't know who this is, or if I let go of who I think this is, then what happens? So, what if I let go of my self-concepts? Do I disappear? Do I lose my identity? Will I die? Right? What happens to me? Is it like amnesia? Do I sort of forget everything I think I knew about me and my relationship to this world? And it's like, what is that space like? And then how do I act? How do I know what to do if I let go of thinking about who I am? Because everything we do, right, is based on this idea about I know who I am, I know what my relationships are, I know where I fit into this universe, in this one unified reality. So if I cross over or enter into this space of unrestricted speech, how do I know what to say? I've got nothing, I've got no handrails, because we say things based on this, right? So if I let go of my clinging to what I think this is, then how do I know what to say? So we can be afraid of being sort of unmoored, right? Sort of disoriented, sort of, the anchor drops away and then what? Are we sort of floating around freely? How do we know what to do? So stopping our clinging to five skandhas can put us into that space of unfamiliar territory. This is a space we're not used to being in, which can feel a little bit like, do I really want to do that? Dogen says Shinjin Datsuraku, and on the other hand, do I really want to do that? So we think it's just a kind of a big cloud of confusion and unknown and unfamiliar and scary. So actually entering into, in this context of this gate statement, is understanding. This entering into is realizing, making real, making concrete our wisdom and our compassion. So it's not like we're sort of floating around in a fog, right? We're actually stepping out of the fog of delusion and ignorance and habituated thinking and into a space of clarity, a space of reality, right? Seeing clearly. So that kind of speech, or the kind of speech that arises from that unhindered, unrestricted place, has several names within our tradition. We've talked about them all before, but quick review. Back at gate 6, we started paying attention to the actions of the mouth, headed off a whole group of evils. There's a standard 4 group of evils. So lying, spreading rumors, slander, engaging in idle talk, right? Speaking in a way that causes problems between other people, themselves and other people. This is a traditional definition of right speech on the Eightfold Path, is avoiding that particular set of evils. So at gate 77, we talked about right speech, and we saw that on the everyday level, right speech doesn't create suffering for ourselves and others. And on the absolute level, it's about letting go of words and concepts and the need to be verbal altogether. So keeping this balance is how we keep the 4th precept about not speaking falsehood. So seeing one reality from 2 sides, expressing 2 sides in one action, right? We hear that phrase here a lot. So we need to say things in order to function in the world as bodhisattvas, right? We need to give instructions and take instructions and build relationships and do all the things that bodhisattvas do. We need words and language for that. At the same time, we know that those words are limited. They can't possibly express the entirety of this moment, everything that's happening, everything that's contained in this moment. So we've talked about all of those things. And then finally, some of us have spent more than a year living with the Shishobo, Bodhisattva Shishobo, the 4 embracing actions of the Bodhisattva, one of which is loving speech. And we'll return to that in a minute. So this is not an unfamiliar topic for us. We spend a lot of time on this thing. So entry into the state of unrestricted speech is a gate of dharma-illumination, for with it we attain realization of the dharma-eye. So this gate is saying when our speech is not hindered by delusion and confusion and ignorance, clinging, that it is itself a realization or a making real or a manifestation of the dharma-eye. So Todo-san has talked about the 5 eyes many times. But again, quick review. These come from the Diamond Sutra, right? So there's the flesh eye, the ordinary eye that we all have and that we use every day. There's the heavenly eye, where we can see everything, indoors and outdoors, day and night, light and dark, but we still have delusions and misunderstandings about what we see. Third is the wisdom eye. We see everything with prajna. We have all that clarity, but somehow we lack compassion. We haven't fully developed compassion. 4th is the dharma-eye. So this is our eye of the day. 4th is the dharma-eye. So we see everything as bodhisattvas. We understand and use what we see as a means to liberate beings. So now we have wisdom and compassion coming together, right? So we're seeing clearly, and on the basis of seeing clearly, compassion arises and we're saving beings. We also have compassion for beings, and because of that interconnectedness, we see clearly. So these things are working together. This is the dharma-eye. 5th one is the Buddha-eye. So we see the complete truth of all phenomena, everything there is, how they work, how they're related. We see all of that, and this eye includes all the other eyes. So this is the most powerful, right, of all the eyes. So the gate statement says that when we use unrestricted speech, we tap into this fourth one, this dharma-eye, where we see as bodhisattvas with wisdom and compassion. That means our speech is a real, concrete instance of carrying out our bodhisattva vow to liberate all beings. That sounds great, but how does that happen? Because we all talk a lot every day, right? Is all of that coming from a place of being a bodhisattva? Is all of that coming from that? Maybe not. So how does this happen that our speech becomes an actual concrete manifestation of carrying out the vow? Which is really interesting, right? Body, speech, and mind. So in the Shishobo, Dogen Zenji says, loving speech means, first of all, to arouse compassionate mind when meeting with living beings and to offer caring and loving words. In general, we should not use any violent or harmful words. To speak with a mind that compassionately cares for living beings as if they were our own babies is loving speech. Is that the way we usually speak? Maybe sometimes. It seems important that Dogen Zenji is saying, speak with a mind that sees all beings as though they were our children. That's not easy, right? There's people we like better than other people. There's some people we think are wonderful, and there's people that just irk the devil out of us. How do I treat that, as that encounter, as though that was my child? So this is a practice that starts before we open our mouths, right? As we just saw, body, speech, and mind. This is not just about, I'm going to be careful with my words and start there. This is a practice that starts before we open our mouths. It starts with paying attention to thoughts, paying attention to perceptions, regardless of what we're actually saying. What is our attitude toward people? So can we really see the reality of interconnectedness and non-separation and emptiness in the moment of that encounter? Or are we hijacked by our stuff? Maybe we're not hijacked. Maybe we're just falling into habituated thinking. Are we actually paying attention? So do we really feel the need to take care of that conversation as though we were taking care of our own children? And for some of us who don't have children, like, how do we cultivate that mind? Well, maybe I take care of that conversation as though I was talking to my cats. I don't know, right? I mean, or some, at least, some being that we love, some being that we feel like we need to take some care of, right? So it's easy to fall into social conventions, right? We ask people how they are. You see someone in the morning, the first thing, oh, how are you? Do we really care? Are we listening to the answer? Do we actually want the answer? How are you doing this morning? Oh man, I'm feeling really bad. And then they go on, and you just think, no, I'm just saying hello, right? Sometimes simply showing some interest in somebody's well-being makes a big difference. Like if you really are the one going, yeah, man, I feel really bad today. If somebody actually looks you in the eye and they're present with you and they say, how are you? Even if you say, I'm fine, something happens, right? Somebody cares enough to be really paying attention to that conversation to make all the difference. So not long ago, I read a post from somebody whose partner was dealing with cancer. And I guess, it was a fairly significant cancer. This person was feeling dismayed that all her friends and the people who knew her had not reached out to her as someone who was being affected by this situation. So maybe the partner was getting lots of attention and care and sympathy and empathy, and she's feeling like, what about me? I'm the one keeping the household together. I'm the one getting my partner to treatment. I'm the one just feeling like, my goodness, what happens if my loved one isn't here anymore? And she's saying, what about me? And she said, just clicking on a Facebook post doesn't count. She needed to actually talk to friends over coffee or go for a walk in the woods or think about something besides managing the impact of this illness and this fear that she was going to lose her partner. So, the easy, convenient thing to do is, click on the heart emoji or click on the praying hands emoji or the sad face or something and say, well, I feel good because I've provided support to that person. And, acknowledging that something is happening is good. And maybe we're not in the same town, and maybe this isn't someone we know well, and, maybe that's appropriate. But, is that a real case of loving speech when this person needed something else and nobody asked what that something else might be? So, of course, there are degrees of intimacy in relationships. It might not be appropriate to insert ourselves into a relationship like that. But for people we actually know, it's pretty easy to just click on something and go, there, I'm done. So in my case, this wasn't someone I know well enough to insert myself into that family situation, but it did make me think about and realize, I need to reach out to the people that I know that are dealing with illness, because I know a few. And I thought, these folks are having health issues, and I haven't actually reached out to them and said, are you okay? And what can we do for you? And when I did that, they were really appreciative. So I thought, I'm as guilty as anybody, It was a kind of a kick in the backside from the universe that said, look, you need to pay some attention. How much effort did it take to, reach out to those folks? Not that much, and it made a big difference. So, when we're thinking about unrestricted speech, am I sort of falling prey to my own needs for convenience, and I'm busy and I have other things in my mind? Or am I looking carefully and saying, if I was to treat this conversation or this relationship as though it was my child, what would I be doing? So all of that means we need to, establish our practice and put in the time on the cushion and the zazen work and study before we're kind of ready to meet the world in that way, before we're ready to really respond as skillful bodhisattvas with body, speech, and mind. So of course, practice and realization arise together, practice and wisdom and compassion arise together, and yet, right? It may become easier for us to enter into that space of unrestricted speech if we're fully practicing. Because if we're not seeing all things with the dharma-eye, it's very difficult to engage in this kind of really, truly unrestricted speech or loving speech. So Dogen Zenji goes on to say, when people hear loving speech directly, their faces brighten and their minds become joyful. When people hear of someone else's loving speech, they inscribe it on their hearts and minds. So the power of unrestricted speech or loving speech to liberate beings goes beyond the one person you may be talking to at the moment. If others happen to hear that speech, they benefit too. So maybe they heard it in passing, maybe they were around when you said something useful, helpful, beneficial, they benefit too. If they talk about it to their friends, that merit goes even farther. So we don't know, right? We put an action into the world, karma unfolds, we don't know where that's going. So in that way, we have to be careful. We don't know where that's going to end up. But, it's interesting. Sometimes there's an unintended benefit or there's an unexpected benefit. I know when my mother was terminally ill, and some of her friends saw how I was practicing with that, because I took it as a practice. What can you do? A couple of them said, tell me something about this Zen thing, because this really seems to be helpful. I thought, well, that's interesting, because I never talked to them about my practice, but I guess a few of them knew I was doing this crazy thing. Well, so tell me about that, because it seems to be helpful. I thought, interesting. Simply carrying my practice was enough to make someone go, there's another way to deal with this. Because her friends were grieving for her and were worried about her. There's another way to think about this. So you never know. I was not out to evangelize anybody, but somehow the Dharma will provide. Okay, so we never know where our words are going to end up across space and time, and especially in these days of social media, my goodness, we have to be careful what we put out there, because it never goes away. For good or ill, it never goes away. So a skillful comment that we make might not take root until sometime later. Sometime later someone goes, oh, that's what Sagan meant by such and so. Oh, that's what Dogen was, what Dogen, I've now made you Dogen, what Doji was talking about, right? And it doesn't have to be somebody in robes. It can be grandma, it can be anybody. And we go, oh, yeah, there was that thing, right? And it could be years later. Any of us who've been around in this Dharma world for a while know that years later you go, oh, that thing that teacher said, 5, 10, 20 years ago. Oh, that's what they meant. We never know. Now I know what to do with that they were telling me to do. So we only have to think about how many times stories about Dharma teachers are repeated. In the moment, it was just somebody responding to a student's informal question, making some kind of comment about something, and yet years later, those are turning words for somebody. We are still reading Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, right? We are still reading Shobogenzo Zuimonki. Dogen was saying something in that moment. Sure, he never figured Ejo's going to write it down, and 800 years later, we're still reading it, and those are still turning words. right? Like, wow. So finally, Dogen Zenji says, we should know that loving speech arises from a loving mind, and that the seed of a loving mind is compassionate heart. We should study how loving speech has the power to transform the world. It is not merely praising somebody's ability. So we can say nice things, or maybe we hold ourselves back from saying something that's not so nice because we're irked or frustrated or something. When we don't say that thing, we're going to regret later on. But are we actually encountering all things as our children with clear wisdom, with clear compassion that comes with prajna? Or are we putting on an act because we think we're supposed to? Society says we're supposed to be like this and that and something else. Might be a good starting point, but when we look really carefully, where is the loving mind? Where is the compassionate, wise mind? So keeping ourselves from making mistakes is a good thing, but is it enough? We can't really stop there, can we? We have to shift from relying on our deluded, clinging, kind of habituated thinking, and instead rely on the dharma-eye. So this is something we can cultivate, right? Dogen Zenji says once we start paying attention to using loving speech, it becomes our usual way of being in the world. So we're shifting our habituated thinking, our habituated action toward loving speech. If we really start to understand how the world functions over time, over years of practice or a moment of practice, something shifts, right? So our habituated thinking becomes loving speech, becomes unrestricted speech. It's our usual way of being in the world. He says we're not even going to notice what's happening. If we're just going to immerse ourselves in practice, Buddhas don't know they're Buddhas, right? We're not even going to notice what's happening. But if we practice, gradually our speech becomes kinder over time, becomes less self-involved over time. Why? Because we're not clinging quite so tightly 5 skandhas to 5 skandhas. So finally, he reminds us this kind of speech is really, really important. This is not just a sort of nice to have. He says this is really, really important because it's essential to resolving conflict with others. And in this samsaric world on fire, oh my goodness, do we not want to be able to resolve conflict? So we could say it's essential to resolving conflict, but it's essential to the health of the network, this great, wide, absolute, interconnected network. It's essential to the health of that, right? What are we putting into the network? So conflict is some indication, I think, of 3 poisonous minds. If we've got conflict happening someplace, there's greed, anger, and ignorance, right? Somebody somewhere is caught up in greed, anger, and ignorance, or all 3, most likely, because it's very hard to separate them. And that's the basis of suffering. And as soon as we have suffering, then suffering tends to perpetuate, right? So in this samsaric world on fire, if we can't do anything else to ratchet down the suffering, the conflict, the unwholesome stuff that's happening, at least we can engage in unrestricted speech with each other or with whoever we encounter. That might not feel like much in a samsaric world on fire. But as we've seen, in order to engage in unrestricted speech, we have to use the dharma-eye. Well, if we're going to use the dharma-eye, we have to practice. So, right, this is bigger than just, how are you? So there's something powerful in back of that action. It's not just nice words. It's not just not setting somebody off, right? It's not just complimenting somebody on something. There's something powerful in back of that. The words are a manifestation of, right? The words are a manifestation of the vow. The vow is really powerful. So we're bringing our wisdom and our compassion to that situation. So vow is important. So far I've been talking about speech in a general way, kind of our everyday speech that we use with each other and with everybody all the time. But the underlying sense of the Sanskrit here is like teaching or discussing or discourse. So I think we can apply it to our everyday speech, but there is a kind of a specific pointer here. This is speech that's being used in a particular way. Being eloquent, using our rhetorical skill, our intellectual skill, in this case, to share the Dharma. Talk about the Dharma. So the kanji points to the Sanskrit word nirdesha. So nirdesha is instruction, it's explanation, it's advice, right? It's guidance of some kind. So for example, Vimalakirti Sutra is sometimes called Vimalakirti Nirdesha. So in early texts, when Buddhas or Bodhisattvas are explaining something, it's called nirdesha, right? So this is unfolding the Dharma in a certain kind of way. So this gate statement says if we're going to teach the Dharma, or if we're going to discuss the Buddha's teachings as bodhisattvas using the dharma-eye, then that teaching or discussion is going to come from a place of unrestrictedness. So it's probably good we sit zazen before these talks, or before the Wednesday night discussion group, right? We're going to sort of put ourselves in that place of unrestrictedness and then enter into some kind of discussion of the Dharma or sharing the Dharma. So you may know that this kind of Dharma talk is not the only way we talk about the Dharma in this tradition. This is not the only kind of quote-unquote Dharma talk that there is. This is not the only way we present the Dharma. There is something called the Teisho. And if you've read around, you might have encountered that, because sometimes Teisho get transcribed and published. And I got to say, in that moment, I think they die. Because Teisho are very spontaneous, and as soon as you write them down and you take them out of context, I think they lose some power. Anyway, Teisho is literally presentation of the shout, which I think is really interesting. Because you know all these stories about Zen masters, somebody asks them a question, they go, yeah! And then that's the answer. So this is, presentation of the shout. Now, maybe it's related to lion's roar, I don't know, but this is presentation of the shout. So this is not a sermon. Teisho is not a sermon. Teisho is not an academic kind of lecture. Teisho is not this. It's not about concepts. It's not about factual knowledge. It's not about, what's the word I want? Explanation of a text. It's presentation of insight. It's a demonstration of something. So traditionally, these things happen during Sesshin, and they deal with a koan, or sometimes with a piece of a sutra. Teisho have been described as insight returning to the source. So there's no separation, right? There's some total dynamic functioning happening there. Whoever is making that Teisho, doing that Teisho, is drawing from emptiness and interconnectedness and the true nature of reality, and there is something unrestricted about that. It's not magic, but there's no hindrance. Right? So it's really a demonstration of the direct kind of experiential understanding which is behind those words and concepts and whatever is, we have to communicate somehow. So when you read the koans about somebody asks a question and, somebody does some crazy thing, the teacher, gets up and leaves the room, or, puts a slipper on his head, or lets out a shout, right? It's this direct demonstration of something which is behind the words and the concepts and all the thinking. So the point, if this Teisho is about a koan, the point is not to teach the koan, right? It's not to take apart the koan and explain all the words and give you an answer. It's to show the insight that's underneath that koan. There's more than one right answer to a koan, right? In this moment, the answer is something. Which is why I'm thinking if you transcribe these and take them out of context, something gets lost. So you may not be familiar with this kind of talk because we don't do them here. We don't do Teisho in Sanshin style. There's no talking during Sesshin at all, so of course they don't happen during Sesshin. There's no lecturing, there's no talking, there's no Teisho. And during Sesshin, our practice is to let go of all thinking, including thinking about the Dharma. So it's just not part of our Sesshin style here. Anyway, Teisho as a direct presentation of the Dharma doesn't always make sense on the surface because, particularly if the topic is a koan. When you're listening to a Teisho, you're not trying to understand all the words in a linear intellectual way and come to conclusion at the end, right? It's not that kind of experience. You're not sort of taking that in with the intellect. People will say, well, they sort of think about it as another form of zazen, if this is the style of their practice in their son. Hearing Teisho is sort of another form of zazen, if you will. They just sort of sit quietly and let it wash over them, let it sink in. And again, I think this is probably a case where 5 minutes later or 5 years later, someone goes, oh, that was what he meant. They have some direct experience and they go, oh, right? So that makes me think that not only the speaker, but also the listeners need to be unrestricted. So if there's a person making Teisho pouring out this direct experience of something, and we're all blocked and hindered, we're going to be less than able to take that in. So the speaker has to be unhindered, but the listeners do too. So I think this applies to both in a certain kind of way, right? We have to meet in that space of unrestrictedness, of not five skandhas not clinging to five skandhas. So we need to give up sort of being hindered, being hijacked by our own stuff, jumping to conclusions about what we're hearing. It's really interesting if you read koans, you watch your mind, you just watch yourself trying to get the pieces in the right order and line it all up and come to an answer and go, I know what that means. Here's the answer. And it doesn't work like that. You can just watch your mind kind of tying itself in knots, trying to do what we typically do with a puzzle, using the intellect to try to figure it out. So, I think the same thing if you're hearing somebody do a teisho, you want to come to conclusion about it. You want to decide you like it or you don't like it, or it makes sense or it doesn't make sense, or you agree or not, or something, right? So how can we listen to these things without greed, anger, and ignorance, or any other kind of obstruction or hindrance? So not only is the teacher directly presenting some awakening, some realization, the listener is directly sort of receiving that, participating in that space of awakening and realization. It's not magic. I'm not a woo-woo magic person. That's not magic. It's like we're, all in the same space of zazen. We're all in the same space of sharing that dharma in some way. So neither side is becoming attached to the words. Neither side is, becoming attached to distraction about that. Words are happening because they need to, because as humans, this is what we need to do. But neither side is getting attached to the words or to the concepts. They're both just entering into the reality of this moment. So in other words, unrestricted speech and unrestricted listening. I don't think we can do one without the other. So because the teisho is supposed to be spontaneous, supposed to be expressing, this something in this moment, in this circumstance, usually somebody doing teisho doesn't have any notes. Here's your first clue that this is not it, right? That person is not like preparing ahead of time, like writing a lecture. That person is going, what's going on right now? So no notes, no prep. It might be, not be delivered in a really structured way with full usual sentences, things in the right order, carefully constructed paragraphs. It's coming directly from what's happening right now. So there is no way to write it out beforehand, right? To completely prepare for that. So for new teachers, I suspect giving Dharma talks is one of the scarier things they have to learn to do. Because you're on the hot seat, man. You got to say something, as we say. I was fortunate in that regard in a couple of ways. One is I'm highly verbal. You can't tell, right? Highly verbal. The other is that I spent part of my career coaching presenters, right? So I already kind of know the drill. I understood the skills. I understood the process. That doesn't mean I do this well or something, but it means I had some background understanding. But even so, to get up in front of a group of practitioners and offer something useful about the Dharma is a challenge. So especially when some of them have been in robes longer than you've been practicing. Or some days, not today, your teacher's in the room, right? That's a challenge. So I just watch new teachers. They tend to completely script themselves. They write full sentences and then they read their notes to the people, right? And I get that. It's what we do. That's how we learn. The other thing I see people do is book reports. I see a lot of book reports. I just read this really interesting Dharma book this week and I want to share it with you. And the author says, well, what do you say? What are you bringing to this? Because that's the point of this. So, beginners think they have nothing to add to the conversation. I remember being in that place. Somebody many years ago said, we need someone to give a Dharma talk, where I was living at the time. We need someone to give a Dharma talk. Will you come and do it? And I said, I don't have anything to say. Because I really thought I didn't. And then the person who was asking me got concerned about me. Do we need to talk? Right? And bless her, she was trying to help me. At that time, I thought, I have nothing to add to that conversation. Because I didn't understand, right? All of our experience is an expression of the Dharma. I could have said something, but I wasn't smart enough, or I wasn't experienced enough. So I remember that feeling. You go, I have nothing to add to that conversation. Right? So if we can get past that point of ego and self-clinging, then to me that's where the juice is. in a Dharma conversation, right? I love visiting college classes and just batting the questions back and forth because they ask really interesting stuff like that other people don't necessarily ask. And you can't prep for that. You have no idea. It's like going to a press conference. You got no idea what they're going to throw at you. And they ask interesting things. And then in that moment, Dharma has to come out, you know? It's fun. It's like a tennis match. We're just batting stuff back and forth. I think that's great. So, you know, you have to respond in that moment based on all your study and all your sitting and all your experience and who is in front of me in this moment. I'm not going to talk to a college student the way I would talk to a 5-year-old or grandma or my teacher, right? So like, who's right here and what do they need right now? And how technical do I need to be? Or do I need to yank the rug out from under them? Which is always fun too. Anyway, we have college students in the room, so I'm sure they know that feeling. So every year, you know, when we do the Shuso Hosen, and the Shuso takes questions from the Sangha, you know, there's a part in that ceremony where, you know, Shuso sits up here and says, dragons and elephants, you know, give me your questions. And then it's a free-for-all. We get to ask whatever we want because this person's on the spot. I think for most Shusos, tell me if you agree, that's the part that keeps us up at night. Thinking we're going to be on the hot seat in front of the Sangha and now in front of the virtual Sangha, and they're going to throw whatever, and we need to have some answer that doesn't embarrass us. Because, you know, we think the point of being here is show I'm competent, show my Dharma mastery. Because this is about student teaching, right? The point of being a Shuso is you're sort of the assistant abbot. So you, in that moment, the abbot has handed you the staff and said, okay, teach my people. And you go, you got to have something to say, right? So there's no notes, there's no prep, there's just you and the staff and the questions, and something needs to happen. So interestingly, in my experience, having seen a lot of these things, Shuso, whatever the question is, Shuso tends to go immediately for the most absolute answer. Immediately goes for emptiness in order to negate the question. Is it like this or like this? Neither one, because in the world of emptiness, there's no discrimination. Bang, bonsai, right? Okay, that's how we learn, but I just think it's really interesting. We're going to struggle so hard to negate the question so we don't have to dig into it. Anyway, we tend to be nice. We let them off the hook. Well, you all do. I don't. I tend to follow up and go, no, what did you mean by that? Anyway. So that experience is designed to sort of get us out of our own way as teachers and just let the Dharma come out. And believe me, it's there. If we're sitting there or sitting here or talking with people over coffee, if we just get out of the way, Dharma comes out. It's fascinating. It's like I've said stuff that I kind of look back and go, where did that come from? Well, it comes from, you know, decades of zazen work and study, right? It comes from practice. So if you get out of the way, I think it's way more fun than tying yourself up in knots trying to give an intellectual, impressive answer. Something more natural happens, which I think is much more interesting and much more fun. So many of us here are lay people, never going to do a Shuso Hosen. Why am I talking about that? You might think that's like not relevant for you. You don't consider yourself a Dharma teacher. Why do we care about this unrestricted sort of Teisho thing? Well, have you ever been presented with a question that put you on the spot? What do you think of your coworker's performance on this project? Right? Do you know why I've called you into my office? Or why I've pulled over your car? Or, Daddy, is there really a Santa Claus? Is there a tooth fairy? Is there a God? What do? Right? How about when your sister or your friend says, why me? Why did this terrible thing happen to me? I'm a good person. Like, what do you say? Is that not the same thing? Are you not being put on the spot? And somebody's saying, please help me. Please help me understand this universe. Please help me understand this samsaric world on fire. Like, come on. You want to say something. What are you going to do? So you think you're not called on to respond skillfully from a place of practice in this moment? You think you're not being called on to be a bodhisattva? What are we taking vows for, man? Right? It's not just what happens here. When we go out the door into this world on fire and somebody asks us something, what do we say? Like body, speech, and mind. Like, what do we do? Right? got to come from this place of unrestrictedness. So if you're a bodhisattva, which we've all vowed to be, then unrestricted speech paired with the dharma-eye, partnered with the dharma-eye, coming from that place, I think is one of the most important tools we've got. And now I need to stop speaking about speaking. So what would you all like to say about unrestricted speech or anything else that's bubbling up for you? Let's start with the people here, and then we'll go to the people at home. Folks in the room, anything you'd like to, any reflections or questions you'd like to share? We're all restricting our speech. Please.
I thought the bit about seeing all people as our beloved children is very powerful, and it's a love that it's very important to cultivate.
And we have to do that from a place of not saying, this is my child, I'm better than. Because it's easy to kind of look down on children, right? Oh, well, this is a child. And we infantilize people and say, well, I'm the one with the skills, the knowledge, the experience, the age, the practice. Sometimes, well, I'm better than you because I practice. So I'm going to lift you up. Okay, attitude, right? I mean, maybe you really are going to lift that person, but attitude, right? So it's a trap we can fall into, because this is not the first time we've heard we encounter everything as though it was our child. This is a theme that comes around, but we have to be a little bit careful about that, right? Because we want to infantilize that person or somehow build ourselves. Am I not a wonderful practitioner because I'm eating everything as though it was my child? We can't have any ideas about it. So it's powerful in multiple ways. It's powerful for that encounter, and I think it's powerful for our practice. Five skandhas can cling desperately to five skandhas and still encounter everything as though it was our child. Right? So let go, right? What else from folks here? Please.
Just what kept coming in my mind as you were speaking was how important are you really talking about speech? Because I think in liminal kind of moments, I may draw with them, I may walk with them, and if that in and of itself is wholesome in thought and like that, then maybe words will come, and I'm not blurting something that I think.
Right, we really want to fill that empty space, don't we?
Yeah.
Oh man, we really want to say something just to fill that space, because silence can be uncomfortable. Right? So I certainly think, body, speech, and mind, if what you're doing with someone is dancing with them, or cooking with them, or drawing with them, or something, that's still, I think it's still communicating, but also it's a complete manifestation of something. It's a complete manifestation of wisdom and compassion. So yeah, we use words sometimes because we need to. Was it St. Francis that says, preach always and when necessary use words? Right? So there's something about the way we move through the world as bodhisattvas, if we do that in an unrestricted way, unhindered, not clinging, right? That puts us in that space of unrestricted speech, but it could be unrestricted action, right? That's communicating something too. So, good, yes. Other things from this room? Please, Will.
I agree with the profoundness of treating everyone as a beloved child. At the same time, I also think it's important to bring in the idea that it's not separate from practice, study, and work. Because there are definitely, and I see it every day, parents who don't treat their children as children, or beloved children. And we could speculate on why that is. Maybe they were never shown that love.
Yep.
But within our practice, that can help untangle those ideas that we have embedded, maybe not of our own choosing.
Sure. Well, and again, we have to be careful about, we're sort of using treating everything as our child as a shorthand, because we probably have some shared understanding about what I mean by that, right? But we can have some real ideas about what that is, right? So I think we have to sort of consider, if I really treat all encounters and all beings as though I was encountering my children, like, what does that actually look like? It has to stop being an idea. You know, like what does that actually look like? If I had children in front of me, like how would I treat them? Yeah, because of course there are dysfunctional relationships, right, between adults and children in oh so many ways. And how, depending on how we were brought up, we have ideas about what that relationship is. So maybe saying I'm going to treat everything as my child works for some of us, but maybe that's not the best way to characterize that for everybody. Come up with something that makes more sense for you. Treat everything with wisdom and compassion the way you would like to be treated, or something, right? So there is already no separation between me and this thing that I'm encountering. So in a way, to put something on top of that that says I'm going to treat this encounter, this being, this whatever as my child, is to put an idea right on top of it. So in a way, we shouldn't even be clinging to that. There should just be, I understand non-separation and interconnectedness, and so there's this total functioning, right? But for deluded human beings, as I say, for me, I don't have children. It might be I'm going to treat everything I encounter as a puppy. Or I'm going to, you know, I mean, some being that I can, that I have experience with and that I can understand. So it is important to be aware of our ideas about that relationship, absolutely. And then, you know, if indeed we can treat everything as though it was our child, can we untangle some of our previous twisted karma around our parents or our other sort of authority relationships? It could be, you know, if we're seeing clearly our relationship with other beings, is there a measure of forgiveness? Maybe. We can't change the past. You know, they say forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past, which I think is really interesting. We can't change that, but we can change our relationship with it and how we see it, and can we clearly see the suffering that led to whatever we're carrying, right? It can be a really difficult place, but yeah, can we untangle that? Maybe. Maybe. That's an important thing to consider. Other things in this room? Questions, reflections? Words of wisdom. Sawyer.
So, first of all, I'm remembering that, like in early translations of Opening the Hand of Thought, I think one of the three minds is called parental mind,
Mm-hmm.
and then in later translations it's called nurturing mind.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wonder if that word nurturing,
Yeah.
you know, has a little less like
Charge.
cultural charge around it, and so encountering everything in a sort of nurturing spirit.
Yes. Yeah, that's really helpful because sometimes it's, you know, grandmotherly mind and sometimes it's nurturing mind or parental mind or something like that. So, you know, put in the character that works for you. Yeah, I think something which isn't attached to a societal role or something might be more helpful. So, yeah, nurturing mind. Can we approach each thing, you know, with a mind of nurturing that, whatever it is? Yeah, that's interesting. I'd forgotten about that. I'm glad you brought it up.
Depends on your parents.
Depends on your parents. Well, so, you know, you don't want this to get caught up with your karmic stuff. And at the same time, it's good to, like, notice what's happening. Oh, that doesn't feel okay to me. What's going on, right? That's useful. That's useful. That's an interesting turn for this conversation. Please.
So Dogen's statement about treating everyone as if they're our children reminds me, it feels like an inverse of Kamala Shila's idea that every being we encounter has been our mother many times before.
Mm-hmm.
And that basically that, you know, any social role would be this way. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, I've kind of thought about before, like, you know, because he focuses on the mother part, you know, sort of like, you know, basically anything that is important to you is, you know, you can see in others, even if it's not a parent, that I guess there's a degree of flexibility that you can have of like, what framing can I put others into that'll make me have the most kindness towards them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So we've all got different karmic circumstances, and people will respond to things differently. So, you know, you can, as I say, put any role in there that works. And it might be more useful not to assign that a character. I don't mean a kanji, I mean a role. Depending on your karmic circumstances. And of course, Dogen is simply saying we needed to encounter everything with wisdom and compassion. You know, to not leave one or the other out. So if we are really going to be sort of an embodiment of Avalokiteshvara, what does that look like? 1,000 hands and eyes. What does that look like? So it might be children or puppies or parents or grandparents or friends, but we encounter. I think what it does is sort of break us out of this idea that this person is unrelated to me, that how I encounter this person, how I interact with this person doesn't matter in the long term because we'll never see each other again. It's like you're on a plane next to somebody and you can have a really deep, intimate conversation because you're never going to see that person again. It's not scary. It's like I can say whatever, but I'm never going to have to deal with the aftermath of that, right? So it's really interesting if we treat everything we encounter with the understanding that there's already non-separation. There's already a relationship there. If we, relationship and non-separation don't go together, but there's already a connection there. So why would I not try to have the most wholesome connection possible, whatever that looks like for me, right? So on the one hand, the children, the parents, the grandparents, are helpful as words, and also don't cling to the words, right? It's the direct experience of having that connection. Other things in this room? Is your hand up?
I'm thinking of yesterday. I was going to see a friend I hadn't seen in a while, and they have a brand new tiny little kitten, about so big. And as soon as I see the thing coming into the house, just not even thinking, right? And what I'm thinking is that when I'm doing my best work or even just having my best conversations, I think there's the same attitude just towards whatever the hell is being said. And this seems to me like what you're saying about forgiveness is being able to, particularly in my work, if I'm having something very difficult shared with me, and I'm able to, in some kind of metaphorical way, just be it kind of lends that sort of forgiveness to the person, I think, in what you're saying, right? That it's okay for this to be my past.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and sometimes that's what we need, right? We need to be heard without judging. It's this is the reality of the situation. Okay. Now, going forward from here, what are we going to do? How are you going to meet that situation? So, yeah, so maybe for you, you're treating it all like kittens. Other things here in this room? Please.
I've been, the past couple of talks that I've given, I've been sort of talking about some tangible kind of morality type things, so it's related to this in a way. I think the sort of maybe default approach in our tradition in Zen is that these things kind of spontaneously arise out of our practice, and we don't really have to make them a specific, make a specific effort towards that thing. It just should arise naturally from our practice. But then, of course, there's another angle where you really do have to specifically think and be mindful. I'm going to approach this situation carefully. I'm going to, restrict what I say.
Right.
Interestingly.
Right.
So I'm curious to hear, what you think about those two sides.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because so hearing all of this about, Buddha nature's already here, enlightenment, awakening, Satori is already here, wisdom and compassion arise if we get out of the way, makes it seem like, why do we have this piece of our practice called right effort? And now we're back to Dogen's basic question, why do we have to practice if all these things are already here? Why do we have to practice? So those things might be there, but we have to make some effort about how we manifest them. So in some cases, I think the unrestricted speech is to restrict what you're saying to make a better, more wholesome situation, right? You don't want to say everything you know or everything you're thinking. So, sometimes the unrestricted speech is actually restricted in a certain way. I mean, we've got to apply some intention, right? So all of these things arise naturally feels like we don't need to have any intention. And yet we take vows. And we say we're going to liberate beings, and we're going to go through all the Dharma gates, right? We're going to do all these wonderful things. So I do think there has to be some, I think we can't forget one side or the other side, and it would be really easy to go immediately to the absolute and just say everything's already there, so whatever I say doesn't matter. Or it'd be easy to say, well, I'm going to be very careful and very kind of thoughtful about everything I do in order that something, right? We have a wholesome situation. So interestingly, I think these two things, you can't separate them, because if you're coming from this place of using the dharma-eye, and your speech and your action is not hindered by greed, anger, and ignorance, what comes out of your mouth is going to be wholesome. And probably you're not going to have the impulse, or you're going to be able to notice the impulse that says, I'm going to say that snarky thing. And then you don't do it, right? Because that too comes from a place of not clinging. If you're saying the snarky thing, there's some clinging happening here, because you want something out of that. You want to put somebody down, right, or something. Or you want to overshare to make somebody like you, or whatever that is, right? So I think those two things are absolutely interpenetrated, right? What do you think about that? Because you've been talking about the ethical piece. So like, what comes up for you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree completely. I just think that, I mean, I think you're right to say that there's a fusion of those two things in the way, between them. But yeah, I guess I asked the question in somewhat resistance of this tendency to think in this way, that like, if you just sitting is the answer, and like, that'll like somehow make your speech better without you having to actually apply any effort.
Yeah, well,
people tend to think that way.
They do, and I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a reason we have zazen work and study, right? I mean, if we're just, it's great to sit, we need to sit, and we can't like not sit, but if that's all we're doing, and then we think, well, once I get up off the cushion, I do whatever the hell I want, prajna shila samadhi, right? Where's the shila? Where's the morality? Where's the ethical piece? Where are the precepts? There's a reason we have precepts about right speech, or precepts about how we speak, right? I mean, there has to be, what do we do with it when we get up off the cushion? So sitting zazen is great. We drop off body and mind. We experience that non-separation. We experience 5 skandhas, not clinging to 5 skandhas. And then when we get up off the cushion, what do we do with that? We better have some intention, right? Otherwise we can't carry out vows. Otherwise we're sitting for ourselves, right? I mean, the whole bodhisattva ideal is, yeah, we do the practice and then we turn that around, and all that merit and all that skill and all that wholesomeness goes out to liberate beings. So if we're not being thoughtful, careful, intentional about how we do that, we've missed some piece of it. That's not complete practice. We're not just practicing to make ourselves feel better. Oh, whew, I'm going to enter into Shinjin Datsuraku and then, I'll feel okay. Right? It's like, no, I'm going to do that. I'm going to manifest whatever that's manifesting, but my job as a bodhisattva is to turn that around and do some good in this network. And if we're not fully practicing, I think we're not doing what you're talking about. So yes, we need to be careful not to go down that rabbit hole that just says, I live in the world of the absolute, and I just sit all the time, and that's enough. Because I don't think it is. I think there's a reason we have zazen work and study. Ritoku.
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me of this classic story in India of the yogi who's mastered samadhi, and he goes up into the mountains and he meditates and he meditates and he meditates for years and years and years, and achieves the highest level of samadhi that any yogi has ever done. And then he finally comes out of the mountain and he wanders into the town, and somebody bumps into him. What are you doing?
Yep. So this is the thing, we can believe we've reached some wonderful, blissful state, but then what, right? Then we have the 10 ox herding pictures, right? We're turning to the marketplace with bliss bestowing hands. So we need to come back and be able to do it. And, I think this is partly why in this tradition we say, well, you don't like sit, practice, whatever, sort of reach samadhi, reach satori or nirvana or something, and then you're done. Because interestingly, if you start to have some openings and some awakening experiences, now you have to practice what do I do with that? How do I apply that? Because if I've shifted how I see the world, it's like now I need to have some intention around, now what do I do in the world? Because if you have the rug pulled out from under you, now you have a little work to do, right? You're not done. And that's going to keep happening because we keep peeling that onion, right? So it's not just about I'm going to get to a state and then it's all good. And yes, in the absolute way, practice and realization arise together, but in a very concrete human way. You start to shift your perception and your understanding of how the universe works, and then you need to integrate that. Integrating that can be a challenge, right? So we're never done. Folks at home, do you have anything you'd like to share, say, ask? Which doesn't mean folks from the room can't still join in. In the meantime, let's hear from Will. Then we'll go to people at home.
Whenever I'm listening to a Dharma talk, it just feels natural to apply it to right now, and not just this room, but the world. And it's really hard not to bring in current events
Yep.
into this, and I think it's appropriate to spread the message of loving speech and caring speech, especially in a time of war and potential world war.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you know, it always feels like whatever the latest crisis is means that the world is worse than it's ever been. And yet, you know, we can look back and go, there's always a conflict, there's always something. We've had world wars, we've had other things. So, you know, we certainly need to pay attention to what's happening. And also, in a way, you know, we've been here before. So yes, you know, speech is one of the most important ways we can either resolve conflict or at least not create new ones. And because it's a manifestation of the rest of our practice, it's important in that way. It's more than just the words, right? So, world on fire, yeah. We have to be careful what we say, but also what we listen to, what we pay attention to, what we internalize, what we take in, how we are with each other. If nothing else, even though those conflicts are not happening in our own backyard geographically, it's a good reminder, right, that says the world is on fire. Practice is important. Liberating beings is important. Yeah. We're about to do a world peace ceremony, so we can at least rededicate ourselves to loving speech today. Folks at home, was there anybody, Sawyer, with something?
No.
We're all good? Okay. Oh, Donna, did you have one more?
Well, yeah. Tom Glenn practice has been something that I leaned into and practiced for 25 years. 9/11 was one of the first attractions for me, I think, around that time. And I guess I'm just a big believer in the pause when you're.
So for people who don't know what that is, would you give a brief explanation of that? She's demonstrating. Yeah, she's breathing in and breathing out.
Yeah, this is someone who says they practice it, and then I usually need a prompt in order to practice it. Is it from the Mahayana? It's another. It's not really in this particular.
Right.
No,
style.
Yeah, it's more Vajrayana. Yeah.
Right, it is Tibetan, and where you are saying a bit of a ritualized prayer, but for those closest to you, then moving outward, and you know, to the point at that time that you are wanting goodness for Osama bin Laden, whatever, it was like that. And it was amazing how receptive, well, my son, his friends and whatever, and at the time he was 11, to have something that they could do with adults that they were sharing, but yet was loving, that didn't exactly have an image attached to it.
Right.
They would,
Yeah.
and obviously there's a kind of a post-hash to something like that when you do it, but
Yeah. So this is a practice of basically wishing well for beings. So you're starting, as you say, there's a practice around it, but you're starting with the people that are easy to wish well, people you love, people, your family, your friends, right? And in sort of concentric rings, it's then people that you sort of know less intimately, and then people you don't know very well, and then people you really don't like so much, and then people you've really got a problem with. And by the end, you're wishing well to people that you're surprised you're wishing well to, right? So you're not condoning what they're doing, because remember, compassion is not condoning. Doesn't mean you like what they're doing, doesn't mean you're their best friend, doesn't mean you think that what they're doing is okay. But these are beings who are suffering, and as bodhisattvas, our job is help beings who are suffering. So these are beings who are suffering. They're clearly caught up in greed, anger, and ignorance, so they wouldn't be perpetuating harm on people, right? So can we see past the triggers and the clinging and the stuff and say, this is a being which is suffering. Can I wish well to that being? It's a bodhisattva practice. Yeah. Anybody else today before we move on to world peace?
Just one tiny.
Please.
I think it's I think it comes from Stoic philosophy, but it's almost like it's a really simple kind of wisdom thing. They say you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen twice as much as you speak.
Yep.
So,
Yep. And may we do that. And then when we speak, may that be unrestricted speech.
yeah.
And on that bookend, thank you everybody. Let's move on to world peace.